It was a cold Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day where the gray clouds hung heavy in the sky, and the air had a chill that crept into your bones. No matter how many layers you wore, I was curled up on the couch in my living room, the soft hum of the heater, blending with the rhythmic pattern of rain against the window. An old magazine rested on my lap, its pages half flipped as I distractedly skimmed through articles that didn't hold my attention. The real distraction that was coming from the kitchen. Specifically, the maddening drip of the sink faucet that had plagued me for weeks. At first, it had been nothing more than a gentle tap. An occasional drop that I convinced myself I could ignore. But over time, it had grown worse. The drips becoming louder, more persistent, as if mocking my inability to fix such a simple problem. I tried everything I could think of. Tightening the faucet, fiddling with the knobs. But nothing seemed to work. It had gone to the point where the sound followed me everywhere, even invading my dreams finally. I'd given in, my pride had taken a back seat. And I picked up the phone to call a handyman. I wasn't expecting anything remarkable. In fact, I was dreading the interaction. A stranger in my home, judging my inability to handle something so basic. All I wanted was for the drip to stop, for peace to return to my house and my mind when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me out of my thoughts. I set the magazine aside, smoothing my hands over my dress as I stood up. I didn't rush to the door, taking a moment to collect myself before opening it, and then I froze standing on my doorstep. Was a man who didn't fit the image I'd conjured in my head. He was a middle-aged or gruff like I'd imagined. Instead, he looked like someone who might belong in a movie. Rather than fixing leaky pipes, he was tall with broad shoulders that filled out his navy blue shirt, the fabric stretching slightly across his chest. His face was sharp with a strong jawline dusted with stubble, and his warm, brown eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Kindness perhaps, or maybe curiosity. "Hi," he said, his voice deep and smooth with just a hint of hesitation. "I'm Ryan, you called about a leak." For a moment I forgot how to speak. I nodded quickly, stepping aside to let him in. "Yes, of course. Come in, the kitchen's this way." I led him through the house. Try not to focus too much on the sound of his boots against the hardwood floors, or the way he seemed to fill the space around him. When we reached the kitchen, he set down his tool bag with a practice ease and glanced around the room. "Let me take a look," he said, rolling up his sleeves to reveal strong forearms, tanned and marked with faint scars that told stories of hard work. I hovered near the counter, watching as he knelt to inspect the pipes beneath the sink. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved, steady, confident, as though he'd done this 1,000 times before. His hands worked quickly, tightening bolts and checking connections, with a focus that made even this mundane task seem impressive. "How long has it been leaking?" he asked, his voice breaking through my thoughts. "A few weeks," I admitted, feeling a little embarrassed. I thought I could fix it myself. But I trailed off, shrugging. He glanced up at me, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Sometimes it's better to call in help." No shame in that. There was something reassuring about his tone, and I found myself smiling back. "Well, I appreciate you coming out on such short notice." "No problem," he said, returning his attention to the pipes. As he worked, I couldn't help but study him more closely. His navy shirt fit snugly, outlining the broad expanse of his back as he leaned forward. The way he moved was almost hypnotic, strong yet careful, as though he understood the balance between force and precision. "So how long have you been doing this?" I asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. "About 8 years now," he said, without looking up. "Do you enjoy it?" He paused for a moment, his hands still in on the wrench. "Yeah," he said finally. "It's honest work. I like fixing things. Makes me feel useful." There was a sincerity in his voice that caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting such an answer, and for a moment I just stood there unsure of what to say. "Useful is good," I said finally, my tone light. He glanced up at me then, and for the briefest of moments our eyes met. There was something in his gaze. Something warm, searching, and entirely unexpected. It made my breath itch and I quickly looked away, pretending to adjust a dish towel on the counter. "Well, you're very good at it," I said, trying to sound casual. "Thanks," he said with a soft chuckle. "But it's just a leak still," I said, stepping closer. "You've got a way about you." He froze, then his hands pausing mid-motion. When he looked up again, there was something different in his expression. An intensity that hadn't been there before. "I'm just doing my job," he said quietly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't move though. There was a tension in the air now. Subtle but unmistakable, and I wasn't ready to let it go just yet. I leaned down slightly, pretending to inspect the pipes, and my hand brushed against his arm. He stiffened under my touch, his breath hitching ever so slightly. For a moment neither of us moved. He finished tightening the last bolt and stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "All done," he said, his tone more formal now, as though he were trying to regain some control already. I teased, "You're efficient." He laughed nervously, packing up his tools. I tried to be as he turned to leave. I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Ryan," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped, his eyes meeting mine. His expression was unreadable, but I could see the conflict flickering there, as though he wasn't sure what to make of this moment. "Thank you," I said, my gaze steady for what he asked, his brow throwing slightly for everything I said, my words carrying a weight I couldn't quite explain. He hesitated, his hand tightening on the strap of his tool bag before nodding once. "You're welcome," he said finally, his voice low. I stepped aside, letting him pass, and watched as he walked to the door. He paused briefly as though he wanted to say something, but then he was gone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where he had been, feeling a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me: excitement, curiosity, and a longing I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know if I would ever see him again, but one thing was certain: something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if life would ever feel the same. But life has a funny way of surprising you. The days that followed felt like a blur. Though I wasn't particularly busy, it was Ryan who occupied my thoughts, his presence as vivid as if he were still standing in my kitchen. His voice replayed in my mind, a deep, soothing cadence that had the power to make me feel at ease and completely unsettled at the same time. His laugh soft and a little shy, lingering like a song I couldn't stop humming, and his eyes warm and searching seemed to follow me through my day. At first I tried to convince myself it was just a passing infatuation, a momentary distraction from the monotony of my routine. I told myself it was silly to be so affected by a man I'd only met once, but the truth was, deep down, I knew it was more than that. Ryan had awakened something in me, a spark I hadn't felt in years. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push him out of my mind. Every time I walked past the sink, I thought of him crouched there, his hands moving expertly as he fixed the leak. I remembered the way he had hesitated when our eyes met, the way his breath had quickened when my hand brushed against his arm. There had been something electric between us, something unspoken but undeniable. And then a week later my phone rang. I was sitting by the window with a cup of tea, the soft glow of the late afternoon sun warming my face when I saw the unfamiliar number on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. "Hi, this is Ryan," came a voice on the other end. And just like that, my heart skipped a beat. For a moment I didn't know what to say. His voice was exactly as I remembered: calm, steady, with a hint of nervousness that made it even more endearing. "I just wanted to check if everything's okay with the sink," he continued, his tone polite but hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should have called. A smile spread across my face, warmth blooming in my chest. "The sink is fine," I said, my voice light and teasing. "But there's a problem with the bathroom faucet." Do you think you could take a look at it? There was a pause, long enough that I could almost hear him debating with himself. On the other end of the line, finally, he said, "Sure. I'll be there in an hour." When I hung up, I couldn't help but feel a flutter of excitement. A mix of anticipation and nervousness that made the minutes crawl by. I didn't bother trying to overanalyze it. I just knew I was looking forward to seeing him again. When Ryan arrived, he was just as handsome as I remembered. The late afternoon light streaming through the doorway seemed to highlight every angle of his face, every line and curve that made him so unexpectedly captivating. But there was something different this time. An undercurrent of nervousness that hadn't been there before. His usual quiet confidence was still present, but I could sense the hesitation in his movement, the way his eyes avoided mine for just a fraction of a second too long. "Where's the problem?" he asked, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "This way," I said, leading him down the hall to the bathroom. I pointed to the faucet where the handle had started to come loose. Ryan crouched down to inspect it, his hands moving with practice ease as he checked the connections. I stood nearby, leaning against the door frame, and watched him work. The silence between us was heavy, not awkward but charged with something neither of us dared to name. "Ryan," I said softly. Breaking the quiet, he didn't look up. "Yeah, I've been thinking about you." This time his hands froze. Slowly he looked up at me, his expression guarded, as though he wasn't sure if he wanted to hear what I was going to say. "You have?" he asked, his voice careful, measured. I nodded, stepping closer. "I felt something last time you were here." "Did you for a moment?" He didn't answer, his jaw tightened, and I could see the internal battle playing out in his eyes. The pull of desire against the weight of his own restraint. "I don't know if we should," he began, his voice low. "Why not?" I interrupted, my tone gentle but firm. "We're both adults, Ryan. We don't have to pretend there's nothing here." He stood up slowly, turning to face me fully. His eyes searched mine, and I could see the conflict in them, the way he was fighting to keep the wall between us intact. "You don't make this easy," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "Why should it be easy?" I replied, stepping closer. "Still, sometimes the best things in life are." For a moment neither of us moved. The air between us felt alive, buzzing with anticipation and unspoken words. Then slowly Ryan reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek, his fingers callous but gentle as they lingered against my skin. His thumb moved in a slow, almost hesitant arc, as though we were trying to memorize the feel of me. For a moment we just stood there, the silence between us more powerful than anything we could have said. And then he left. Ryan stepped closer, his hands settling gently on my waist, as though testing the boundaries of what was allowed. His eyes searched mine for a brief moment, as if seeking permission, before he leaned in and pressed his lips softly against mine. The kiss was gentle at first, unhurried and careful, like a question waiting for an answer. His lips were warm and soft, moving against mine in a way that sent a wave of warmth through me. It wasn't rushed or overwhelming, just the opposite. It felt tender, thoughtful, as though he wanted to savor every second of the moment. My hands instinctively rose to his shoulders, steady myself as my heart raced. His arms tightened around me slightly, pulling me closer, but with a gentleness that spoke of restraint. The kiss deepened, but it remained soft, measured and unspoken, acknowledgement of the connection we had found in each other. There was no urgency, only the quiet certainty of two people sharing something neither had expected. I could feel the warmth of his breath as he leaned back just a fraction, his forehead resting lightly against mine. The room around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of our unsteady breathing and the quiet stillness of the space. He tilted his head and kissed me again, softly and slowly, his hand moving to cut the side of my face. His thumb brushed over my cheek, a simple gesture that felt more meaningful than words. I closed my eyes, letting myself relax into the moment. feeling a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in a long time. When he pulled back, his gaze met mine. His expression open and tender. He didn't speak, and he didn't need to. There was something in the way he looked at me. A quiet understanding. A shared vulnerability that said more than words ever could. For a long moment we simply stood there, the world outside forgotten. As we lingered in the warmth of the connection, we had discovered something neither of us have been searching for, but had found all the same. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. Ryan's forehead rested against mine, his warm breath mingling with mine. For a moment neither of us spoke, both of us too caught up in what had just happened, in the weight of what it meant. And I couldn't help but think that sometimes life, surprises are exactly what we need. I don't know what I'm doing, he murmured, his voice low and raw. Neither do I admitted, my heart pounding in my chest. But maybe that's okay. He laughed softly, a nervous boyish sound that made me smile. You make it sound so simple. It is, I said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Life's too short to complicate things, Ryan, he said, stepping back slightly, though his hands remained on my waist. I've spent so much of my life playing it safe. You know, doing what I'm supposed to do, staying within the lines, and where has that gotten you? I asked gently. His gaze dropped, and I could see the weight of his past and his expression nowhere. He admitted, I've spent so much time fixing other people's messes, I forgot how to take care of my own. I reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. Maybe it's time to start. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and I could see something shifting in his eyes, a resolve, a decision to let go of the walls he built around himself. Okay, he said finally, his voice steady. Okay. The hours that followed felt like a dream. We sat on the couch in my living room, talking about everything and nothing. Ryan opened up in a way I hadn't expected, sharing pieces of himself that felt raw and real. He told me about his childhood, growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone. His father had been a stern man, always pushing him to be practical and responsible. Ryan had followed that path for years, working a corporate job that drained him, until he finally walked away and started his plumbing business. I've always been good with my hand, he said with a small smile, holding them up. It's simple work, but there's something satisfying about it. Fixing things, making them work again. I listened, fascinated by the layers of this man, who would seem so reserved when we first met. He wasn't just a plumber or a handyman. He was kind, thoughtful, and quietly vulnerable in a way that tugged at my heart. In turn, I told him about my life, about my failed marriage, the years I'd spent trying to piece myself back together. After it ended, I told him about my love of painting, how I throw myself into art as a way to heal. It's funny, I said, swirling the wine in my glass. I thought I was done with surprises. At my age, you start to think you've seen it all. But then you show up, and then what? He asked, leaning closer. I smiled, and suddenly life feels new again. Ryan reached for my hand, his thumb tracing small circles on my skin. You've done the same for me, he said softly. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Ryan started stopping by more often, sometimes under the guise of fixing something around the house. But it quickly became clear that neither of us needed an excuse. We fell into an easy rhythm, one that felt so natural. It was hard to believe we had known each other longer. He teased me about the way I always hum when I cooked, and I'd laugh at the way he pretended not to notice when I caught him staring at me. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find him standing by the window, a thoughtful expression on his face. Hey, I said softly. He turned, his face lighting up at the sight of me. Hey, what are you thinking about? I asked, leaning against the counter. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. You. I raised an eyebrow. Oh. And what about me? He smiled. A slow, genuine smile that made my heart flutter. Just how lucky I feel to have met you. I walked over to him, wrapping my arms around his waist. "The feeling's mutual," I said, resting my head against his chest. For a long moment we just stood there, holding each other, as the afternoon sunlight streamed through the window. In the weeks that followed, Ryan spent a lot of time with me. Our bond grew stronger as we navigated the challenges together, and I found myself falling for him more deeply than I ever thought possible. One night as we lay on the couch, his arms wrapped around me, he whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out." I replied, my voice steady with conviction. He kissed me then, slow and tender. And I knew in that moment that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive in a grand, dramatic fashion. Sometimes it sneaks in quietly, like a soft knock on the door. And when you open it, you realize it's exactly what you've been waiting for all along.